Today's Sunday, May 15th, 2026. Today's EO Rand is brought to you by What If. Carmelo Anthony was drafted by the Detroit Pistons. Before I say anything, I like to make a disclaimer. I'm not as good. I didn't make the NBA. I will never make the NBA. I will never be as good as them. And congratulations to Carmelo Anthony for having a great career, for being in the Hall of Fame. For all his accomplishments in the game of basketball and being a very well-off man because of his basketball skills. Congratulations. So before I say things that disparage what he did in his basketball career, don't be like, but you never made it. You couldn't have made it. Yeah, I know that. I'm not stupid, you idiots. Okay? Because all you idiots out there know who you know who I'm talking about. You know who you are when you say, but you never made the NBA and you couldn't do this and you're not rich. Good. Now shut up and let's move on with the conversation. So people are like, well, if Carmelo Anthony was drafted by the Detroit Pistons, so they beat the Spurs, they win the championship. No, they don't. No, they don't. And I'll say it all the time. Ben Wallace is correct. Everything will be ruined with Carmelo Anthony being on that team. Nobody cared about how many shots they took. Nobody cared about the glitz and glamour of that team. It was all about winning and playing hard defense. Carmelo Anthony, yes, he was young, but he was not waiting patiently for Larry Brown, because Larry Brown was known when back in the day when guys actually, when rookies were rookies, and meant you got to learn the game. Carmelo Anthony is not waiting. Even then in Denver, he got all the shots up and stuff like that. And he wasn't going to get the shots in Detroit. And if he was going to ruin that flow of that offense, playing 94 feet. And they're probably not going to get Rasheed Wallace at the trade deadline, making their defense two big guys in the middle trying to get past. And they're definitely not having that game streak where, I don't forgot that game streak in 04 where they were giving up like less than 70 points a game for like 8 straight games. There's no way that's happening with Carmelo Anthony on the roster. And everybody says, well, Darko was the second overall pick and he was willing to sit on the bench. Well, why wouldn't Carmelo Anthony? Because especially in that time, back in the day, right? Carmelo Anthony was coming off a crazy March Madness tournament when March Madness was huge. He was the best college basketball player in the world, and that was a big accomplishment for Syracuse winning the national championship. He was a big name. The media would have had a big deal with him not playing. Darko Milicic came from Europe. Back then, there was no social media. The internet was, I wouldn't say, wasn't the newer phase, wasn't new. If you missed SportsCenter, you really, well, obviously SportsCenter was running all day, but you missed the highlights. You really missed the highlights of the game if you didn't watch SportsCenter back in the day. And DirecTV was like newer. Darko Milicic was, even now, no one cares what a person does in Europe. Nobody says, well, that guy in Europe is dominating. People care more now than they did then, but it's not a big deal in the United States. So the United States fans were not going to make a deal out of it. So Darko Milicic's not playing. There was no pressure for the Detroit Pistons not playing him at all. And in the flow of winning games, which back in the day, it was an excuse. You could say Darko Milicic's not playing because you're not winning games. But if Carmelo Anthony and you're winning games and you're not playing this second pick of the draft who just won the national championship, even if you're winning a lot of games, it's a distraction. And you have to understand that. And people think that's not true. That is true. It was a little bit of a distraction with Carmelo on the team. And I will say this about Carmelo Anthony, about him not winning the title throughout his career. People could say he didn't have good enough teams. It's hogwash. The reason why he didn't win a championship was because he was the best player and he wasn't as good as the top-notch guys. He was a very good player, a nice scorer, off the bench. And I got not off the bench, my bad. He was a nice scorer. He was a bull in the post. Very solid scorer. But top of the notch players was like a top 2-3 player that could lead a team to deep runs in the playoffs. He did that 1 year. Really, that was it in his career. He had that one solid year with the Knicks that won 54 games. And people could say whatever they want about he didn't have this, he didn't have that. He had shot blockers in Denver, in the paint, Nene, Birdman, and Marcus Camby and Kenyon Martin. Those were great shot blockers at the rim. I don't know about Nene, but the rest of those guys were. He had defensive players who were willing to scratch it on defense with Aaron Aflalo. He had Chauncey Billups, solid point guard, by the way, who was still very good at that point when he traded. And even before that, he had Allen Iverson who was still averaging 25. He had a lot of names on his teams, but people kept saying, and they'll always say like, oh, he didn't have a team, da-da-da. He didn't have the players like the other guy. He just wasn't as good as the other guy. That was LeBron, Kobe, etc. He had good teams. And the Knicks, remember when he came with Amari Stoudemire, people were like, him and Amari are going to be this lethal deal. And then they get Tyson Chandler, who was Defensive Player of the Year with the Knicks, by the way, in the 66-game season. And I'm not going to go with insanity. I'm not going to go there. Everybody would go there and criticize him because it didn't continue when he showed up. I'm not going to go there. But I will say this. Even Amari at that point had that back injury. Amari was able to score 20 when he was still a solid player. Tyson Chandler was a perfect player for him. A lob at the rim guy. Didn't complain about shots. Tipped the ball back up every time. Great defensive player. Great defensive anchor. Solid player all those years. But here's the problem. Every time it was like they weren't winning. It's like, hey, he didn't have the players. He did. He did have the players. He had a solid Raymond Felton at that point. He had guys who did their role. And every other team, let me say this about basketball. Basketball help, the main help is the best player. That's the main help. After that, it's guys who knew their role and did it very well. And they didn't do anything. Maybe they weren't special players, but they did their role extremely well. And he had shot blockers. He had guys who could catch the ball at the rim and dunk. And I'm not going to talk about, oh, what about that team after 2013? Well, 2014, they didn't make the playoffs. And it was the run back team from 2013 virtually. And JR was on that team. JR was a 6-Man a Year award. JR was a very solid role player. And by the way, could take the pressure off for creating his own shots too. He had Iman Shumpert was on that team. That guy was able to play defense on people and really, really was a lockdown defender. I don't understand like what the guy needed. But whatever, that's what it was. Every time the guy went to a different team, there was excuses about this, excuses about that. And then later in his career, where he still had stuff left in the tank, he goes to Oklahoma City, and it doesn't look good. It didn't look very good. And he made that laugh about off the bench. And I understand that because how good of a player he was and what a name he was. But you weren't there. You weren't those guys. You weren't the LeBrons, the KDs. You were a solid player, and I'll give you that. But you're talking about those? No. But again, congratulations on a nice career and a nice life. But if you were in the Detroit Pistons not winning a title. And I'll say that with the what ifs. I know what ifs mean nothing because it never happened. But you're not winning the title with that team. Tayshaun doesn't care about shots. Never did. Richard Hamilton didn't really care. Maybe he didn't on the inside, but not on the outside. Rashid never complained for some reason. In Detroit, there was stuff going on other teams that people were talking about of rumors with Rashid in Portland, but in Detroit there were no rumors. And maybe later on, but not when those teams were winning. And maybe Detroit, by the third or fourth year, when Ben is not there anymore, and the salary cap and Rashid has to go and all that, they have to pay Melo. Maybe Melo becomes this great scorer in Detroit and becomes a franchise, but nothing's happening as far as titles because it's just you weren't as good as the LeBrons and the Kobes and the Kevin Durants and the Steph Currys. So what were you gonna do? I don't understand that. So I'll go down as saying Carmelo Anthony to me. I don't know. This guy has just a big name, I guess, from Syracuse, but from the NBA, I didn't think he was like, he's not an NBA legend to me. He's a nice player. Congratulations on a nice career. Have a good day.